How do you plant a cutting? How do you get it to root? This is something I covered in previous videos, mainly in How to Replant a San Pedro Cutting, which was uploaded already 5 years ago. It was followed by repotting a 2-tall San Pedro, which show you my use of volcanic stones in order to prevent rot, as well as to give stability to really tall cuttings. Now I think it's time for another video on the subject. Today I will show you how I replant my most important cuttings, those that I definitely would not want to rot. Rot is usually not going to be lethal on a large cutting, but by the time you notice it and perform surgery, you may have lost a good chunk of it. This is a technique I've come up with after rooting hundreds of cuttings over the years, and although it's a bit more work than just planting the cutting in the soil and be done with it, this method will almost completely remove the risk of rot, while ensuring faster rooting, which is key to prevent etiolation. What I normally do for the majority of my San Pedro cuttings is just plant them in 50% soil, 50% perlite, like shown in my video, How to Replant a San Pedro Cutting. And then I hope for the best. Hopefully the cutting won't rot, and it will make roots quite fast so that the tip doesn't etiolate. After a while, the green skin that is below the soil surface will adapt itself to its new conditions and start to become more resistant to rot until eventually corking. I'm not sure how long it takes for the green skin to cork. Less than a year for sure, because when I repot the cuttings about a year later, the skin has already corked. In the meantime, you have to be very careful with waterings, as the green skin can easily rot if it is in contact with wet soil too often or for too long. Simply planting the cuttings in the soil usually works better with shorter cuttings than longer ones. In order to give stability to longer pieces, you have to bury them deeper. And the deeper the green skin finds itself in the soil, the more likely you will have rot. This is why I developed a method which I explained in my video, repotting a 2-tall San Pedro. It consisted of putting a barrier of volcanic stones between the soil and the plant. That totally solved the problem of rotting. It can rain on the plant often, but the sides of it will dry extremely quick, and therefore there is very little risk of rot. About a year later, you can repot the cactus, and you will find that the sides have completely calloused. An added bonus to this method is that it gives really tall cuttings plenty of stability so that they don't tip over under their own weight. What I would like to show you today in this video is a slightly different method that I've been using lately, but only for my most prized cuttings. So let me show you the process from the beginning, which is when you get a freshly cut piece. Normally you would store the cutting horizontally for a few weeks until its cut has healed. Count about 1 week per inch of width. So for a 3-inch wide cutting, you should leave it to heal for about 3 weeks. And healing should be done outdoors, because the airflow will be 1,000 times better than inside your house. If it rains on them, that shouldn't be too much of an issue, as long as it's for no longer than a few days. But storing them horizontally has disadvantages. The area touching the ground may cork, and side roots may start poking through. Neither the cork nor the roots are an issue for the health of the plant, but they don't look good and won't go away. Another downside of storing cuttings horizontally is that the tip of the plant may continue to grow while it's being stored. And it won't grow in line with the rest of the plant, which would be horizontally. Instead, it will try to grow vertically. Of course, in just 3 or 4 weeks, the tip won't have the time to complete a 90-degree angle. But it may start to grow at a different angle than the rest of the plant, and that is something that would leave its mark on the plant forever. Another option is to store your cutting vertically until the cut ends have healed. The issue here is that the freshly cut surface will be resting flat on the soil or on the floor, with no space to breathe, which highly increases the likelihood of unhealthy mold and rot. Of course, if the piece is cut diagonally, then you can place it vertically, and there will still be enough airflow on the cut surface, giving it a much better chance of healing with that issue. But if it's a straight cut, then I would not attempt to rest the cutting vertically. I have a better way, and that is the first step of my new method. Basically, you place the cutting vertically on top of some metal wire structure, either stainless steel or epoxy coated so that it won't rust, like for instance these IKEA drawers. This allows the cut to heal with excellent airflow. You will probably need to tie up the top of the plants to the wall or to something else so that they don't fall down. I use zip ties, but you can use something else if you don't want to use plastic. You can leave the plants like this for a few weeks until the cut part is fully healed. And that takes us to the next step of this new method, where you rest the cutting onto some soil. The pot doesn't have to be much wider than the cutting itself, although it can be a bit wider if you want to. It doesn't really matter, as it is just a temporary pot where the plant can start rooting. To promote rooting, I personally use 1 part regular potting soil to 1 part perlite. But you could even double the amount of perlite if you wanted, as the perlite allows the soil to breathe, and roots love that. Just keep in mind that if you do that, the soil might dry a little bit too fast, and soil humidity is definitely one of the key triggers of rooting. That's why personally, I like to stick to equal amounts of soil and perlite. When you prepare the soil, it has to be wet. And this whole technique, which I'm showing you today, is best done during spring and summer with warm temperatures and preferably some direct sun. Here in Spain, where the sun is strong, a few hours of sun are more than enough. Or you could filter the sun if you're going to give them sun all day. Do not attempt to root a cutting outside in winter with cold temperatures. You are risking rot, and you're very unlikely to get roots until spring. So maybe you should just store your cutting somewhere cool and dark until spring. And I don't mean the fridge, absolutely not. More like your garage, providing temperatures stay well above freezing. Now if you have an indoor grow with a light and warm temperatures, then it's different, and you should be able to get your cutting to root in the winter. Just make sure that you buy a plant on which the cut is already healed, as it is very difficult to heal cuttings indoors due to the lack of good airflow. If you must heal a cutting indoors during winter, aim a fan at the cut end and hope for the best. You may also be able to get your cutting to root in the winter if you place it in front of a sunny window, providing the temperatures inside your home are warm enough. Basically, if you think the conditions are similar to the conditions of spring or summer outside, then you should be good. Otherwise, wait until spring. Anyway, once you've rested your cutting on top of some soil, you should water on a regular basis. It's the combination of wetness and warmth that triggers the root-making process. In the growing season, you can water maybe once every 2 weeks if the temperatures are warm. Once a week if it's hot, or maybe even twice a week if it's very hot. Just make sure that the top layer of the soil has the time to dry between waterings. That will decide how often you can water. When should you check for roots? Not very often, if at all. Personally, I never check for roots. I just repot the plant after a few months, and by then there are always roots. How many months is a few months? Well, you will probably have roots after 2 months. But if you can wait longer than that, that leaves enough time for the roots to become larger and tougher, and therefore less likely to be damaged when you repot. With the classic method, where you just plant the bottom of the cutting in soil, you have to be very careful with watering. Maybe doing it once a month, because the risk of rot is very high when the green flesh is buried below the soil surface. And the deeper it goes, the higher the risk of rot. But with this new method I'm showing you today, there is no green flesh below the soil surface. The only part of the cutting in contact with the soil is the bottom edge, which is already calloused. For that reason, you can water more often, and as soon as the roots start to develop, there will be water to absorb. Furthermore, the sooner the cutting gets fresh water, the least likely it will etiolate. I leave the cuttings in that state for about 2 months, or it can be even a bit longer if you want, so that they build even more roots. Here, I am about to repot a cutting of Bridget's Blue Mystic. My guess is that it's going to be root bound, because I left it on top of the soil for 6 months, which is a bit too long. The first step is to remove the old pot. I press a bit on its sides in order to loosen it all up. Once you feel the pot is freed, you can pull it out. Just as I expected, there are a lot of roots. No big deal, but if you're planning to leave a cutting sitting on top of soil for longer than 2 or 3 months, then it might be a good idea to go for a larger pot, so that the roots have more space to develop. My cuttings of Blue Mystic have spent 6 months on top of the soil, from early August to February. It's worth mentioning because half of it is winter, during which the plant will be less active and make less roots. If the 6 months had been spring and summer, then the plant would have made even more roots to the point that it would now be very difficult to separate them. Here, it's still possible to free most of the roots by spraying water onto the soil. The pressure of the water very quickly dissolves the soil around the roots. Of course, if you don't wait so long, then there won't be as many roots, and you can just separate them with your hands without using the garden hose. Although I use these gloves to keep my hands clean, they will also give some degree of protection against spines. You still have to be careful handling the plants because some spines will go through, but the thick latex and woven fabric definitely help. You can then try to untangle the roots. You don't have to make a thorough job of it, just loosen up the roots a bit so that they don't follow the shape of the pot anymore. Whenever you untangle roots, there's likely to be some broken or damaged roots, which is why I recommend leaving them to air dry for a few days so that they can heal. At the very least for a day or two, but something like 5 days is even better. To repot the plant, you start by putting some soil at the bottom, and then you lay the roots directly on top of it. Then you add more soil on top of the roots. If it's a tall cutting, where stability is more of an issue, the soil level should not be too high, maybe about a third of the pot's height, and then the rest of the pot will be filled with rocks, which will give the plant stability. If on the other hand it's a short cutting, then stability won't be an issue, so you can fill the pot with more soil, something like 2/3 of the pot's height. Like I just mentioned, you should fill the rest of the pot with volcanic rocks. I like these volcanic rocks because they are irregular in shape and tend to lock the cutting into place. Round or oval-shaped rocks won't work because they are more slippery and will move under the weight of the plant, allowing it to fall over. Once the plant is repotted, you can water normally, like any other San Pedro, and you can leave it in this pot with the volcanic rocks for about a year. When you repot it about a year later, the part that is below the soil level, or should I say below the rock level, should be fully corked. On the screen now, you can see what a cutting looks like after only 5 months. The green part that was buried in rocks has started to cork. Cork first appears in patches. Give it another few months and it will be fully corked. It is then safe to repot it in your favorite soil mix without volcanic rocks. You can fill it up with soil up to the top of the cork, and the volcanic rocks can be reused for another project. This method is probably the safest to successfully root any cutting. I don't do that for every cutting I have, because it requires a bit more effort, and also because those volcanic rocks are more expensive than regular soil. But if I have important cuttings, I will use this method. By the way, if you're curious about the cutting I've shown in this video, I will briefly show you what they are. Here on the left you have Blue Mystic, a Bridgetsi that is very bluish in color, and on the right, Peruvianus Hechizo. I got both plants from another trip with my buddy Suriel to that hippie community in Spain where we had already been last year. That's when I brought back Pacanoi Macia and the incredibly fat Scopulicola Goliath. Bridgetsi Blue Mystic and Peruvianus Hechizo are quite fat. The examples you see here are not particularly wide, but I can tell you both mother plants impacted me with how huge they were. I won't show you any photo of them because the community organizes ceremonies, and for that reason, it's best to protect their privacy. Interestingly enough, the one in charge of the community told me that these two varieties give a somewhat darker trip, more intense, something which he attributes to the presence of spines, adding that Scopulicola Goliath, which is spineless, gave the smoothest trip. I'm not sure what to make of this, to be honest. I believe that the psychedelic experience can vary from a strain to another, or a species to another, but I find it strange that the presence of spines would have anything to do with that. But maybe he's right, who knows. Anyway, I now have the 4 main strains that they grow for ceremonies there. Pacanoi Macia, Scopulicola Goliath, Bridgetsi Blue Mystic, and Peruvianus Hechizo. I only got cuttings that were about to flower, which allowed me to do some great crosses in the past few months. I have crossed these 4 new strains with many of my own plants. For those of you looking for a bluish color plant, I have Bridgetsi Blue Mystic crossed with Pacanoi Francis, or the opposite, Francis times Blue Mystic. Other good bluish ones should be Blue Mystic times Pacanoi Colosso, or Blue Mystic times Peruvianus Occulto. If you are looking for monstrous genetics, I have Blue Mystic times Pacanoi TPM SPM, and also the opposite. Terskeki Ivy, which also usually gives some monstrous, crested and variegated seedlings, finally flowered again this summer, and has been crossed with Blue Mystic and Scopulicola goliath. Terskeki ivy and Scopulicola goliath also happen to be my two fattest plants, so I cannot wait to see how fat this cross will be as an added bonus to its freakiness. If you're looking for pure Bolivian torch, I have Blue Mystic times Bridget Tiburon. And on a side note, I also have some pure Peruvianus seeds available at the moment. I thought it would also be neat to get the 4 varieties from that EP community crossed with each other. I managed to make most possible combinations between Pacanoid Macia, Scopulicola goliath, Bridget Blue Mystic, and Peruvianus Hechizo. So you can just select the ones that most appeal to you. Some of these crosses are going to be pretty wild. My current selections of seeds is by far the best I've ever had, in fact. If you want to buy some from me, please send me an email and I will email you back a list with photos and prices. My email address appears in the description of this video. I will also make it appear on the screen now. It's sanpedromastery@protonmail.com. Please mention your country when you email me. I hope you enjoyed this video. Sorry it took me a long time to come up with a new video. Doing all these new crosses and preparing the seeds actually sucked up a lot of my time. But it is fun, so much fun, so I'm not complaining. Take care, my friends, and I will be back soon with more videos.